Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 3, Towards the Abyss. Nearly 5 years intervened between the annexation of Bosnia and the crisis which led to the World War. They were years of acutely increasing tension, marked at intervals by shocks and tremors. On 2 occasions, as we can now see, Europe must have come very near to the brink. The process of decay or disruption in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the effort of Ottoman revival, and the growth of the power and assertiveness of the Balkan states were all continuous. The characteristic of this period is that Austria had now to deal with a Russia profoundly estranged. Beneath the surface of correct diplomacy and much superficial affability, all the nations of Europe steadily and rapidly increased and perfected their armaments by sea and land. In the spring of 1911, a French expedition occupied Fez. This development of the Anglo-French agreement about Morocco irritated German feeling. Some small German commercial interests were alleged to exist around a sandy bay on the Atlantic coast of Morocco called Agadir. The new German foreign minister, Count von Kinderlin-Wächter, brought these claims to the notice of the French government. The French declared with truth that there were no German interests at Agadir, nor in its hinterland. Not a harbor, not a trading establishment, not a house, not a bale of goods, not a German. Nevertheless, recognizing that Germany had some grievance about French expansion in Morocco, they were prepared to offer some territorial compensation in the Congo basin. As for Agadir, they proposed a joint visit of accredited French and German representatives to the desolate spot in order to examine the facts or want of facts about the German interests there. Suddenly, on July 1, it was announced that the German emperor had sent a gunboat, the Panther, to maintain and protect German interests at Agadir. The Panther was already on her way. The alarm which this abrupt but otherwise trifling action caused throughout Europe is the measure of the strain of those times. The act of Germany might mean nothing or everything. If it meant nothing, why was it done? Clearly it was intended to raise large issues. July and August were dangerous months. By the middle of August, the harvests of Europe are largely gathered and the stubble fields are cleared for war. If Germany intended to pick a quarrel with unlimited consequences, July 1 was a convenient military date to choose for opening the debate. After the long story of Bismarck's calculated and successful wars and the various later episodes which have been here recorded, culminating in the summary treatment of Russia in April 1909 and the German Emperor's shining armor speech about it, none of the chancelleries or general staffs of Europe could exclude the gravest possibilities from their minds. France became intensely alert, and every German movement was watched with silent but profound attention. The British Admiralty, whose eye was already fixed upon German activities at Madeira and in the Canaries, drew the notice of the Foreign Office to the effect which a German naval base on the Atlantic seaboard of Africa would have upon our food and trade routes between South Africa and South America. When Count Metternich mentioned the subject to Sir Edward Grey, he was told at once that the situation was so important that it must be considered by the Cabinet. And on July 5 he was further informed that the Cabinet could not disinterest themselves in Morocco, and that until German intentions were made known, the British attitude must be one of reserve. This vague but weighty declaration, all the more significant because of the small action which had called it forth, was received in absolute silence by the German government, so far as we were concerned. For some weeks, not another word was spoken on the subject between the two countries. Meanwhile, the telegrams which passed to and fro between the different capitals became increasingly obscure and perplexing. Mr. Lloyd George, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was gravely alarmed. Hitherto he had headed that section of the cabinet which was predominantly opposed even to the consideration of war in any form. On July 21, however, with the agreement of the Prime Minister and Sir Edward Grey, he interpolated in his speech as Chancellor to the Bankers' Association at the Mansion House an extremely stiff warning to Germany of the dangers which might attend the further progress of her policy. The actual passage, the point of which was entirely lost upon his city audience, was as follows. If a situation were to be forced upon us in which peace could only be preserved by the surrender of the great and beneficent position Britain has won by centuries of heroism and achievement, by allowing Britain to be treated, where her interests are vitally affected, as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations, then I say emphatically that peace at that price would be a humiliation intolerable for a great country like ours to endure. Germany was not only startled but staggered by this challenging utterance. No government not separated by salt water from the German army would have dared to utter such words. Following as it did upon the large increases in the British Navy, it revealed an unmistakable antagonism alike to German ambitions and methods. Accustomed to have French ministers dismissed at his order, the Kaiser immediately sent a fierce and menacing protest through his ambassador. After the speech of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, no explanation could be made by Germany. If France should repel the hand offered her by the Emperor's government, the dignity of Germany would compel her to secure by all means the full respect by France for German treaty rights. Mr. Lloyd George's speech, to say the least, was a warning to Germany's address and had, as a matter of fact, been interpreted by the presses of Great Britain and France as a warning bordering on menace. Sir Edward Grey replied at once that in view of the tone of the German communication, he also was not prepared to offer any explanation. Orders were immediately given to secure the British fleet against surprise attacks. There is no doubt that in the weeks that followed, the Kaiser and his government measured and weighed the issues of war and peace. They were not used to coming in contact with powers outside the sweep of their sword. They felt they had been openly confronted with a will as stern as their own. They decided eventually that the occasion was not propitious. But as August passed away, there were so many reports of German military movements, particularly in the garrisons along the Belgian frontier, that both anxiety and suppressed excitement grew in the Foreign Office and the War Office. The Committee of Imperial Defense on August 23 made a prolonged examination of the military and naval problems likely to be raised by a general European war in which Great Britain might be engaged. This was the first time that such a possibility had ever been squarely faced by the Liberal government. Colonel, afterwards Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, the Director of Military Operations, explained in close detail and, as it proved, with perfect accuracy, the German plan of invading France through Belgium, and the part that would be played by the British Expeditionary Army should Parliament decide to become the ally of France. He also gave an appreciation of the Russian military strength, plans and mobilization timetable, which was found disappointing by those who had considered Russia an armed colossus, but which also turned out to be true. The British and French staffs, who had been in contact since the Algeciras Conference of 1908, remained in the closest association during these weeks. Most of the leading officers of the British Army had long been convinced that war with Germany sooner or later was certain, and all held we should without hesitation stand at the side of France, if she was attacked. It was obvious that both the Foreign Office and the General Staff considered the position to be one of acute danger at the moment, and of increasing difficulty in the future. The cabinet did not share these views, and Parliament, unaware of the facts, would instantly have repudiated them. By the end of September, the situation became easier and an agreement between France and Germany was reached based upon territorial compensations in the Congo. It was plain from the resignation of the German colonial minister that there had been a severe internal struggle in the German governing organism. Differences of view were found to exist between the General Staff and the Admiralty, and an impression was sustained by the Prime Minister and his government that the disposition of the fleet at the beginning of the crisis had left much to be desired. As the result of these pressures, I became First Lord of the Admiralty in October, and thereafter devoted myself exclusively to the preparation of the fleet for war and to securing its instant readiness. The German government announced its intention of making further important increases in the army and navy. Sudden and grim as had been this confrontation of Agadir, in an odd way it improved the relations between Germany and Great Britain. As soon as the crisis was over, we set to work to bridge the gulf which gaped between the two countries. We did not wish the inevitable German naval expansion to become a further cause of dispute. We therefore arranged that Mr. Haldane should visit Berlin and explain our naval point of view and intentions to the Kaiser. We also sought to interest Germany in some colonial negotiations which would be to her advantage. All this was done to try to establish relations of mutual respect with even the hopes of goodwill. Amicable conversations ensued about the most delicate and serious naval issues. The policy to which I obtained the assent of the cabinet was, in brief, to announce a 5-year program of dreadnought shipbuilding, which would secure a superiority of 16 ships to 10 over any existing German naval program, and an additional construction of 2 ships to every one that Germany should build under any new naval law. Dominion and colonial dreadnoughts would be additional, and we declared an intention to maintain our cruisers and flotillas at double the German strength. Alternatively, we offered to have a naval holiday, in which no British or German capital ship should be laid down for a year, or if possible to space out the programs of both countries so as to leave a blank year between 2 annual quotas. The naval holiday was rejected by Germany, and she proceeded with her naval law, but in consequence of the frank and friendly talks which had taken place, both the German increases and our counterbuilding, which were punctually executed, caused no bickering. Indeed, they were accompanied year by year by the increasing retirement of the naval issue from Anglo-German controversies. I held strongly that the Germans would understand a plain, straightforward policy of this kind, courteously deployed and strictly carried out. That they would not resent the fact, but would accept it. This proved true. The Kaiser and Tirpitz realized that they would never have any chance of overtaking us, and that we were bent upon an overwhelming superiority at sea. They accommodated themselves to this, turned with interest to the colonial discussions, and in all the troubles of 1912 and 1913 worked hand in hand with Sir Edward Grey to keep the peace. Never, in fact, had the relations of Great Britain and Germany been so little strained, or indeed so promising as they were a fortnight before the great disaster. But for this detent, Europe might not even have surmounted the unceasing strains and stresses which the next 3 years brought upon her from the Near East. On the other hand, France and Russia, of course, took note of the strong, independent, self-reliant attitude of Great Britain and began to reckon her as a real factor on which they could count in case of German aggression. In this same July 1911, Italy exposed her intention of taking from the Turks the ancient Roman province of Libya, known as Tripoli. During the Agadir crisis, she continually pressed this demand upon the Turks. In September she sent an ultimatum, and on October 5 an Italian expeditionary force seized the town of Tripoli and a strip of the seashore thereabouts. Turkey and Italy were thenceforward at war. Europe remained dumb in the face of this unjustified act. The Central Empires could not afford to lose the fact, nor France and Russia the prospect, of an Italian alliance. The Young Turks resisted the outrage with spirit. Enver himself made his way to Libya and animated the defense. Large Italian forces were for the long time held up on the beach. Here was the heaven or hell-sent opportunity for which Conrad had waited so long. Here should be the first and most important of his preventive wars. Ever since 1899, when he went to command the garrison at Trieste, he had distrusted Italy and longed for the chance of regaining Venetia and Lombardy for the empire. While cabinets at Vienna and Berlin treated the alliance with Italy as a secure factor, I characterized it as a gross fallacy. I saw in Italy the enemy in all circumstances and compared the Triple Alliance to a three-legged table which must collapse if one of the legs gave way. The antagonism was indeed profound. On the one hand, the cause of Italia Irredenta, on the other, the Austro-Hungarian Alsace-Lorraine. For years, Conrad had persisted in urging a war with Italy. From the end of 1910, he became vehement. Italy, he declared, would be ready for war in 1912. It was folly to wait. Ehrenthal rejoined that the Triple Alliance did not fall to be renewed till 1914. Conrad asserted that the alliance was a fraud. But now, seeing Italy compromised and entangled on the Libyan shore, he addressed a lengthy memorial to the emperor declaring that Austria's opportunity had come and that it was suicidal to leave the opportunity unutilized. Ehrenthal, though patient with his fiery coadjutor, was at length aroused. He wrote to the emperor that it was high time the foreign minister should remain competent and responsible for foreign policy. The duty of the chief of the staff was to make the military preparations requisite for the various possibilities of war, but without any right to influence as to which possibility should arise. The Archduke, by now hostile to Ehrenthal, sustained Conrad's personal position, though he did not agree with his war policy. The full force of the dispute fell upon the emperor. He had no doubts at all. He saw plainly that Austria's mainstay must be Germany, and if Germany did not wish to quarrel with Italy, neither must he. Germany could not afford to estrange Italy. He could not afford to estrange Germany. On September 27, Baron Wolfras, by the emperor's directions, interviewed Conrad. His Majesty wishes to have order and normal intercourse between Conrad and Ehrenthal. Conrad should write a couple of lines to Ehrenthal to say that he regretted that the matter had been thus set forth. Conrad replied that before writing an apology to the Ehrenthal, dem Ehrenthal, he would rather have his right hand cut off. He had always been upright, and now in my old age I do not bow myself. The furthest he would come was, if His Majesty requires peace between Ehrenthal and me, I propose that we say, what has been, has been. A line will be drawn under it, and the matter is then done with. He added that he had never in his life had to apologize, and that the Archduke had strictly forbidden him to resign. Wolfras, after bewailing the stony path of mediators, reported the conversation to the emperor, and Conrad carried his table to the Archduke. On October 8, Conrad handed a further memorial to the emperor, urging military measures against Italy, and on the 17th he received a reply in brief and general terms of the sharpest character. His department, he was told, was to strive for the utmost readiness for war. while the foreign minister, in knowledge of the same, conducted his own affairs in accordance with His Majesty's will and in agreement with the two minister-presidents. On November 15, Conrad was received by the emperor, when the following conversation ensued. The emperor, very excited and very angry, reproved Conrad. His Majesty, I say at once, the continual attacks on Ehrenthal, these pinpricks, I forbid them. Conrad, I beg your Majesty to permit me to state my views as I now hold them. Your Majesty then decides. His Majesty, these continual attacks, especially the reproaches regarding Italy and the Balkans, which go on being repeated, are directed against me. The policy is made by me. It is my policy. Conrad, I can only repeat that I wrote down my views just as I arrived at them. Your Majesty can of course mark them wrong. That is in your Majesty's power. His Majesty, my policy is the policy of peace. To this policy of mine all must accommodate themselves. My foreign minister conducts my policy in this sense. It is indeed possible that this war may come, probable too, but it will not be waged until Italy attacks us. Conrad, if only the chances are then still in our favor. His Majesty, so long as Italy does not attack us, this war will not be made. We have never had a war party at all hitherto. Conrad, those whose duty it is to see to it that all is ready if war breaks out, so that we do not come into a difficult situation from the outset, may not utter the word war, for otherwise they will be accused of belonging to the war party. His Majesty, prepared one must be. The emperor then proceeded to aim a shaft at the Archduke. He criticized the bellicose attitude which the German crown prince had revealed to the Reichstag. That will indeed not happen with us, but there are indications of it. This stormy audience could but be a preliminary to dismissal. A fortnight later Conrad, again summoned to Schönbrunn, was relieved of his post and transferred to an inspector generalship of the army. The reason, said Francis Joseph, is well known to you and it is not necessary to talk about it. His Majesty, says Conrad, was pleased to say that our personal relations had become most friendly, and he had sent for me in order himself to intimate my dismissal, because the direct way appeared to him the best. His Majesty then paused, in the evident expectation that I should speak. Conrad, I most humbly thank your Majesty. I have always only gone the direct way. His Majesty, then we have both acted alike and we part as friends. Upon this I was dismissed. The Ballplatz lost no time in informing the Italians of Ehrenthal's victory over Conrad, and all immediate tension ceased between the two allies. In February 1912 Ehrenthal died. His work was done. He had had a few months of excitement and triumph. He had secured a ceremonial satisfaction for his country, but the price was heavy, and through his own short-sighted sharp dealing, needlessly heavy. He could have gained all he sought far more easily by treating Izvolsky like a gentleman. He had invoked the might of Germany against Russia upon a minor question. He had used a steam hammer to crack a nut. Until 1907 he had followed the cardinal maxim of Bismarck, namely that every step taken by Austria in the Balkans should be preceded by agreement with Russia. In 1908 he had suddenly discarded this wisdom. He had embroiled Austria and Russia. He had poisoned the relations between the two neighboring empires, who could so readily with mutual advantage have disentangled and cherished their interests in the Near East. He had involved Russia in a public humiliation which the ruling forces constituting public opinion around the Tsar would never forget. He was fortunate not to live to endure the outcome. Ehrenthal was succeeded by the late Austrian ambassador at St. Petersburg, Count Berchtold, the owner of the chateau at Buchlau, where the unlucky conversations with Izvolsky had occurred. Berchtold was one of the smallest men who ever held a great position. His caliber and outlook were those of a clever Foreign Office clerk of junior rank, accustomed to move a great deal in fashionable society. Fop, dandy, la-di-da, amiable, polite, and curiously unself-seeking. Immensely rich, magnate of a noble house, habitue of the turf and of the clubs. Unproved in any grave political issue, yet equipped with the all-too-intensive training of a chessboard diplomatist. Thus conditioned, Berchtold fell an easy prey. He was allured by the glamour and force of the military men, and fascinated by the rattle and glitter of their terrible machines. We gaze with mournful wonder upon his doubting eyes and his weak, half-constructed jaw. We contemplate a human face in which there is no element of symmetry or massiveness. We are appalled that from such lips should have issued commands more faithful to the material fortunes of mankind than any spoken by the greatest sovereigns, warriors, jurists, philosophers, and statesmen of the past. Berchtold is the epitome of this age, when the affairs of Brobdingnag are managed by the Lilliputians. Since her painful experience in 1909, Russia had lain low, but neither her military preparations nor her diplomacy had been idle. A war between Italy and Turkey seemed to favor a renewed Russian effort to obtain that privileged freedom of the Dardanelles for her warships, which had so long been a prime object of Muscovite desire. Russia now offered Turkey in distress a defensive alliance modeled upon the Treaty of Unkia-Skelessi of 1833. Territorial changes likely to involve other great powers were excluded. The Russians offered to guarantee the maintenance of the present regime in the Straits of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. The Ottoman government were to promise not to oppose the passage of Russian warships through the straits, provided that these ships did not stop in the straits or only by agreement. There was no basis for such an arrangement. Deep-rooted in the heart of the Turks was fear of Russia. In Russia they saw the probable destroyer of the Turkish Empire. In the Russian territories of the Caucasus they saw the greatest prize that Turkey could win by a victorious war. The young Turk leaders were saturated with these ideas. Indeed, they had already resolved that, should the long-predicted European war break out and Russia find herself at grips with Germany, they would invade the Caucasus with their principal armies. As this operation required the Turkish command of the Black Sea, it was necessary for them to become a naval power. They had already raised largely by public subscription the funds to purchase 2 dreadnought battleships, the orders for which had been placed in England. They were therefore much embarrassed by the Russian proposal, and on learning that Great Britain and France were in no way pressing it, they rejected the overture with promptitude. The second rebuff to Russian diplomacy led Monsieur Samsonov, who had now succeeded Izvolsky, into a remarkable change of front. Under his guidance, Russia set herself actively to form a league of the Balkan states against Turkey. The elements for such a confederacy were certainly not lacking. History reeked with the wrongs which Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece had suffered at Turkish hands. By the desperate struggles of generations, they had freed themselves from Turkish yoke. Now the old oppressor, still in control of many Christian provinces, was in the toils. This was the moment to settle old scores and acquire new possessions. It needed only the influence of a great power which had long warred with the Turks to unite them in an effective alliance. Indeed, it may well be that Russian diplomacy was only encouraging the Balkan states to do what they had already resolved. On October 8, 1912, Montenegro declared war upon Turkey. Serbian, Bulgarian, and Greek declarations followed in a few days. The hardy and dauntless men who had seized power in Turkey marshaled their utmost resources to resist this dangerous combination of their hated foes. The course of war was swift and its results unexpected. To no class had the crushing Turkish defeats come with more surprise than to the military experts. Konrad had always thought poorly of the Serbians. The German General Liman von Sanders, at the head of a military mission, was actually reorganizing the Turkish army, and the staff in Berlin were confident of Turkish successes. In high British military circles, an inveterate distrust of the Greeks as fighting men lay joined with their traditional liking and partisanship for the Turks. All these authorities were stultified by the event. The Greek army, which 20 years before had fled incontinently, now advanced with energy and speed in spite of heavy losses. The Bulgarians fought with the utmost skill and valor. But it was to the despised Serbians that the principal merit was ascribed. Not only did their troops fight skillfully and well, but their field artillery and heavy guns, trained and supplied by the French, played a decisive part both upon the battlefields and in the siege of Adrianople. By Christmas the Bulgarian army stood before the lines of Chatalia, and King Ferdinand was dreaming of a triumphal entry into Constantinople. But while the Bulgarians had been fighting in Thrace, the Greeks had reached Salonika and the Serbians Kavala. A general victory was no sooner assured than the conquerors were at each other's throats. Bulgaria, behaving a most arrogant manner, found herself opposed by Serbia and Greece. Fierce fighting broke out in February 1913. The Greeks and Serbians fell upon their late ally. Overweighted by numbers and exhausted with her losses against Turkey, Bulgaria reeled before this onslaught. At this moment, Romania, which had taken no part in the war, invaded Bulgaria from the rear and conquered the Dobruja. Bulgaria, crushed and cowed by overwhelming strength, made such terms as were possible. She was deprived of almost all conquests, barred from the sea, and stripped by Romania of the very province from which her most famous and most heavily smitten division of soldiers had come. In the confusion, Enver Pasha had returned from Libya. He advanced with inexhaustible audacity and recovered Adrianople. On these accomplished facts, the Treaty of Bucharest was eventually made. All the reactions of these two Balkan wars were evil. The German government and especially the Kaiser were most disagreeably impressed. Their long wooing of Turkey, their vaunted support, had only accompanied the Ottoman Empire to its greatest disaster. The fact that they had trained, or at least had been the patrons of the Turkish army, while the French had supervised the technical preparations of Serbia and Greece, was unpalatable to the German general staff. But the vexation of Austria was indescribable. The Serbians had not only proved their prowess in the field, they had doubled their area and increased their population by at least 2/3. All the confident expectation of Vienna and Budapest that Serbia could be beaten by the Turks in the First Balkan War and by the Bulgarians in the Second were proved false. They found themselves face to face with the ambitions and hostility of that greater Serbia, whose very existence threatened the vitals of the empire. Russian elation inflamed the Austrian wrath. It was common talk in Vienna that a world war would come unless something happened to modify the unwholesome effect of the Peace of Bucharest. The Serbian troops in the course of the war had reached the Adriatic, and the Serbian government stridently proclaimed their intention of keeping the Albanian coast as their window upon the sea. The Austrians refused to tolerate this, and although the Kaiser derided the idea of war for a few Albanian goat pastures, war between Austria and Serbia was only averted by the prodigious labors of all the great powers assembled in London, and especially by the cooperation of Great Britain and Germany. Conrad, banished from the council chamber to a military command, had no official influence upon the policy. He distributed to the principal personages in power a series of essays by an onlooker at epoch-making events which no patriot can view with indifference. He strenuously urged war with Serbia simultaneously with mobilization against Russia. He acquired great influence with Berchtold. The war spirit which dominated the rank and fashion in Vienna during the winter of 1912 and throughout 1913 was favorable to him. In December 1912, he was once more appointed chief of the General Staff by imperial decree. He ceaselessly ingeminated war. On December 14, "If the monarchy means to resolve the question which touches its life interests, the best means appears to make war now against Serbia despite all calms." On December 23, "Sole means to a solution, overthrow Serbia by war, undismayed by consequences. Though the entente powers, together with Serbia, may be strong enough jointly to threaten the monarchy, yet we are powerful enough to confront these states with the choice of a general war, of which the most important among them are in fact afraid." On December 30 to the Archduke, "We have reached the point where there is a trial of strength between the monarchy and Serbia. It is a trial which must be seen through. All else, Albania, harbor question, consular question, trade agreements, etc., are side issues." His appeals were supported by the new war minister, Krobatin, and by Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, who wrote fatuously, "But in God's name, anyhow, no rotten peace. Better a defeat on the battlefield in a struggle with a great power than that." This was not, in the end, to be denied him. However, the Habsburg royalties did not share the excitement of their generals and statesmen. The emperor remained immovable. Again and again he repulsed Conrad's demands, using such phrases as, "Even in politics one should stick to the rules of decency. That would mean war, and I am against war. That must be done without a great deal of forethought. We must do nothing without mature reflection." With such replies did the vigorous, clear-headed octogenarian restrain the fierce currents of the times. In all these views he was supported by the Archduke. Francis Ferdinand's influence had restored Conrad to his post, but the Archduke would not accept his policy. His attitude in February was thus described to Conrad by his equerry, Bardolph: "The heir to the throne has sounded the retreat all along the line. In no circumstances will he have war against Russia. He will not consent to it. From Serbia, not a plum tree, not a sheep. He demands demobilization of the reserves." Berchtold, under this august influence, changed his own attitude with agility, and when Conrad came to him for sympathy and support, blandly told him, "I would never put my name to war against Russia. The Archduke Francis Ferdinand is absolutely against war." The cause of all this virtue and wisdom is not obscure. One single reason had decided the emperor and his heir. They had been left in no doubt that William II did not mean to fight. The Kaiser had conveyed this opinion to them both in the most forceful and confidential manner. They knew that without him they could do nothing. From their highest station and with their direct proprietary interests at stake, they viewed facts in truer proportions than their servants and advisers, and their control of the empire was effective. The peace of Europe during 1913 rested solely upon the Kaiser's no. One hand only held the key that could unloose the deluge. From the moment that Austria had quarreled with Russia, William II had the dual monarchy in his power. While his veto stood, the world was safe. It now remains to examine the causes and events which led to that veto being withdrawn.